Hey guys, we are going to be moving on to the early civil rights movement. For this section, we are going to be focusing on American society during the 50s. So, our objectives for this lecture, the early civil rights movement, are to describe American life as it is developed during the 1950s, including social, economic, and political issues, and evaluate the significance of the Cold War in these changes. So we'll be doing that. In addition to it, we'll be describing the breakthroughs forged by the early African Americans in the 1950s and the retaliatory movement that came to be called massive resistance. So obviously there's going to be these huge changes going on in the United States after World War II. For this lecture, we are going to focus on the early civil rights movements, who the people are involved with it. We'll be identifying the particular events, the individual events, specifically. But before we get into all of that, we need to talk about the 1950s society. So in the last lecture, we were covering the Cold War, but it was more like in terms of the political ramifications for this, the political ramifications regarding the United States and its relationship to the Soviet Union after World War II. For this lecture, we are going to focus on, another big consequence of the end of World War II, which is the end of segregation and the civil rights movement. To put it into perspective, right? So as the Cold War is going on and we talked about McCarthyism and all of that stuff is still going on. Just think of it, it's going on in the background, right? To all of this. So there's a lot of tension, not just because of the Cold War, but because of the civil rights movement that's about to take off. So, but in addition to that, the 1950s, you have to sort of think of what's going on here. So the 50s were a time of recovery and economic growth. Part of the reason for that has to do with the GI Bill, which is also known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And what this does is it creates financial help for these soldiers that are coming back after World War II, and assists them in acquiring low-cost mortgages for them to buy homes, loans for going to school, not loans, but tuition, and housing for school, and loans for them to start businesses. So this is going to increase some of the economic development that is happening during this time, because that's the thing that I have to sort of get you to think about is what is going on in the United States at the time. Financially, the first couple years after World War II, it was a bit of a, what's going to happen? Are we going to revert back to the depressions, economy, or are we going to be moving forward? And the GI Bill has a lot to do with moving the economy forward. In addition to that, we also have to talk about President Truman's Fair Deal, right? So what the Fair Deal actually did was it increased minimum wage, it provided federal funds for home building, education, and healthcare, and all of that. So remember, this is all about getting that economic ball rolling again, okay? And making sure that we don't go back to the Great Depression type economy, because we want to keep what away? We want to keep communism away, okay? So it works. Consumerism is going to be at an all-time high. That, again, is going to stimulate that economic growth. And part of the reason for that has to do with, the fact that a lot of people went without these things during the war. They'd saved money. So consumerism is really going to increase. It has to do with the fact that there's a lot of products for consumers to buy. Products are becoming much more, what's the word I'm looking for? like electronic and convenient. Okay, so there's also going to be products that are going to make life easier. Things are going to be done faster. And again, so because there's so many products out there that are designed to enhance the lives of Americans, more people are going to buy them. So there's more money because people are getting paid more. Because they saved some of that money through the war because they couldn't buy things. Remember that there was rations for food and clothing and all kinds of items. So people are making more money. They have more money to spend. There's lots of consumer goods to buy. And so what this means is there's going to be a housing boom. Okay? Particularly it has to do with the fact that the GI Bill makes it easier for these servicemen to get loans to buy homes. But then also consider the Levittowns, right? Those like almost like pre-manufactured homes that were like cookie cutter houses, and you had these neighborhoods that all the houses look the same. So there's a housing boom. Remember when we talked about the 20s, how we said that the car was kind of like the status symbol? Well, during the 50s, the home is kind of like the status symbol. Being a homeowner is where it's at. All of this leads to high birth rates, the baby boom, right? The baby boomer generation is going to be coming out of this time period. So home ownership is at 50%. Suburbs are going to explode. I mean, everybody's going to be moving to the burbs. And this has specific ramifications for the cities, right? So remember, this happened during the industrialization of America, right? As more people were able to go out of the city using transportation, right? Public mass transportation, they were able to work in the city. But when, they punch the clock out, when they punch out every day, they get to go home. They just get on the subway or mass transit, and they're able to go live in the suburbs. And what happened in the industrialization of America and what's happening during this time is very similar. What that means is that people are paying taxes outside of the cities because they live outside of the cities. So all of that money is going to be leaving the inner city, meaning that there's less money for schools, there's less money for police, and ultimately what happens here is there's going to be a decline in the quality of life inside of the city. And by the way, who's living in the inner cities? It's mostly minorities and African Americans, right? The other thing too that goes back, touches on the previous lecture, is this age of conformity, okay? 1950s society can be described in that term. Conformity, okay? There's an emphasis on conforming. There's an emphasis on avoiding unusual ideas, not wanting to look suspect. Fear of communism is there, okay? And because of that, I mentioned in the classroom before, it kind of leads to this kind of awakening later in American women, where they bought this idea that getting married and having children would somehow bring them happiness and fulfillment. But then, they realized that none of that was true, that they had everything they could possibly want, and yet they were still unhappy. So we'll talk about the feminine mystique in a couple more lectures down the road. For now, think of all of these changes that are happening to the United States economically. It's booming. It's doing really well. It's bouncing back. It's almost like a roaring economy all over again. It's recovering well after World War II. People are buying homes. They're having children. They're getting married. And it seems like prosperity is, on the horizon for many folks. The middle class is growing more than ever. And the thing that you have to realize here is that while it seems like the 50s is fantastic, there's a lot of economic prosperity, there's a group of people here that are being excluded from this, and that tends to be minorities and African Americans. They are being excluded from this so-called, you know, economic growth. Okay, people are doing better financially. They're getting married. They're having children. They're buying homes. You know, they have the 2.5 kids and the 2 cars and all of that. And for a lot of Black folks in America, the realization that they're kind of like being left behind, and in light of the fact that they served their country, and they went and they fought over there and they liberated Europe, and then they come back over here and they're treated like second class citizens, didn't really sit well with them. So in the next lecture, we are going to talk about the beginning of the civil rights movement. We'll talk about specific events. But for now, put this introduction, in the background to the events that we're going to talk about next, because it's very, very important that you understand what is going on in the rest of America while, the civil rights movement is beginning to pick up energy, and the pace is becoming increasingly faster and growing, and it's reaching more people. So all of that has to do with TV, right? With the fact that there is so many of these events that are going to be popping up, that are going to be covered by the media, that Americans are going to look at and really kind of like analyze what's going on in America during the 1950s. And that's going to be the lecture coming up next.